Welcome back to the 1/32nd scale Tamiya Corsair build. In this episode, I'm going to show you how I detail the awesome Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial, or the Double Wasp as it was also known. There's nothing quite like a big oily radial engine. I can almost smell the avgas just thinking about it, so let's not waste any more time and get to it. First, I highlighted a clear part callout in the instructions. I didn't want to install this now. I make a habit of doing this with parts I'm going to save until the end of the build. When that time comes, going back through the instructions will ensure I don't miss anything. I sure as heck don't expect myself to remember everything, and I'm getting old after all. Before I started on the engine, I needed to get some of the less sexy assembly stuff out of the way. This is covered in step 21 of the instructions. I began by gluing in the insert for the fuel cap. This part's a tight fit thanks to Tamiya's exceptional tolerances. Installing the fuselage spine was the next order of business. First, a hole was drilled to allow install of a part later in construction. Clever engineering from Tamiya on a part that fits so snug you'll never know it was a separate part. There's no seam to worry about. Great stuff, Tamiya. Now I could move on to the fun stuff. First, I referred to the instructions to verify which parts were needed for the first step of assembly. These were carefully removed from the sprues, and attachment points were diligently cleaned up. You'll notice I used Gunzy's black liquid cement. I just recently purchased this product, and I'm growing to really like it. It makes assuring the entire join was glued that much easier. Now it was time for me to tackle the most tedious and time-consuming bit of the engine endeavor, the ignition ring. In 1/32nd scale, I think this detail is just too prominent to leave undone. The Tamiya kit piece is fine, but I had to modify it. I just don't have a tool small enough or the dexterity to drill into such a small space to run the wire from the molded part. So I decided I would cut new pieces from .05 brass tubing. To make this job quicker and more consistent, I made a simple jig from some scrap styrene. This allowed me to cut the 40 or so bits of tubing I needed in the same size over and over. It was now time to modify the kit part by removing the molded wire harnesses and replacing them with the brass. I started by modifying the kit ignition ring, cutting off the wire harness bases and using a file to sand the part flat. The little trick I used here to keep my head straight was to remove one pair at a time, place them with the brass parts, and repeat. I was afraid that removing all of the plastic bits to be replaced at once would ultimately end up with me having issues placing them in the proper location. With the ignition ring outfitted with the upgraded brass tube thingies, it's time to wire things up. For this, I used some .015 lead wire from a fly tying set. You can get this from Bass Pro Shop or similar places in the US. It comes with an assortment of sizes and comes in real handy. You can see here that I got a little carried away, making sure to leave enough excess wire to work with. Later on, you'll notice that my compulsiveness in this matter wasted a good bit of wire. It's good to have some extra length to work with, but perhaps not this much. Now it was back to more basic assembly of bits of the engine in preparation for starting the paintwork. It was now finally time to break out the airbrush. The ignition ring was first. The brass and lead needs to be treated like photo etch, so it received a coat of Mr. Metal Primer-R. I airbrushed this then with Mr. Leveling Thinner. Then I moved on to priming all the other parts with Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 in black. It was about this point that I realized I'd forgotten to drill out the spark plug on the engine cylinder heads where the ignition wires will attach. I'd have preferred to have done this before priming, but it didn't make much difference. I quickly knocked it out and moved along. Now paint. I started by shooting the cylinder banks with MRP chrome. I did this straight over the satin finish of the Mr. Finishing Surfacer because I'm not really interested in a highly reflective chrome finish. I do like the way the chrome looks here, however. Painted the ignition ring and wiring with alclad pale burnt metal. I'm using a particular reference photo to inform my painting. There appears to be a number of color options that would work here, but the reference I'm using shows the ring and wiring in an oxidized gold color. This is something I think I can replicate later, with this serving as the base color. And if you're enjoying the video, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it's absolutely free. Thanks! A couple different MRP metallics were used to paint some remaining details with some slight variance in tone. The prop boss was painted with Tamiya medium blue. Now I started the multi-step process of finishing the exhaust. I start with a coat of neutral gray. This will provide a base layer for things to come in the future. But before getting to that, I needed to do some detail brushing with some Vallejo flat black. Now it was onto some detail work. Here I mixed up a lighter version of the medium blue base on the prop hub. I picked out the raised details to give the part some depth. Now the Prismacolor silver pencil from episode 1 returns. Like with the cockpit, I used the pencil like you would dry brush. This will give some depth and wear to the parts and line the outside of the engine. Parts that will never be seen, but I have to satisfy the urge. Now it's back to the exhaust. The next step following the gray base coat was to use a fine brush and some dirty white acrylic paint, mixed with some white and khaki, to add another layer. If you look at photos of the exhaust, you'll often see a faint white patchiness that forms as a result of heat. The exhaust is a work of layers, and the next layer was applied with MIG Ammo Shadow Rust. I'm going to use a sponge to dab this onto the exhaust tips over the previous gray layers and the white spot. Now I've prepared a palette of oils on a piece of cardboard, acting along light rust, dark rust, and smoke. Bleaching the oils on cardboard makes them dry much faster and allows them to be worked in multiple ways. If I want them wet, I just add some mineral spirit. Once the oil is set for a couple hours, it was time to apply it. Though I laid out some rust tones, I felt that the previous work done with the acrylic rust was enough. The oils weren't adding much, so I stuck with the smoke to add the final bit to the exhaust, representing soot buildup. I'll note here that I've just worked the tips of the exhaust. This is all that will be seen, and while I will do work that isn't seen in other places, I decided to skip the upper third of the exhaust pipes and focus my time elsewhere. The last little bit on these parts is to use some ammo gunmetal pigment to give the tips of the exhaust a metal sheen. Now I use some Tamiya panel line accent color in black to give the cylinder head some depth. Now I switched gears and prepared some Epsilon engine grease. This is a great color for weathering around engines, obviously. First I applied a wash to the prop boss. I follow that by using a stippling brush to work in a grimy effect. The last step here was to use the engine oil diluted with mineral spirits to add some splash effect to the engine parts. Now it was time to start bringing parts together. Here you can get a sense of just how much excess wire I attached to the engine ring. Parts were glued with a basic CA using a glue looper. Now a small decal was applied to the prop boss. I used a dab of Tamiya decal adhesive to ensure a snug fit. This works great on small decals that might otherwise not stick well. Think of it as an insurance policy. Now it's time to do some more basic assembly. And like that, it was now just a matter of pulling all of the final bits and pieces together. I first addressed the wiring, starting with running the appropriate links to the rear engine bank so I could assemble the outside engine pieces where appropriate. Then I addressed the forward wiring and brought the sub-assemblies together, and the engine was completed. So I thank you for joining along, and I encourage you to check out episode 1 of the cockpit assembly if you have not already seen it, and I'll see you in the next installment. Until then, take care.